My intention was to give you what I think would have been a very boring explanation and presentation of European foreign policy, its intricacies, its ups and downs as we are facing this challenge now for many years. But I think today we need to change all this and go to the heart of the matter as we're facing this Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I think it is, to a very large extent, an existential moment for Europe, a turning point in European history, not only the European Union, but the whole European continent, as we all understand that what has happened in recent days has been somewhat a shattering moment, putting an end to the European security order as it existed since the Helsinki agreements in 1975, and I think opening a new era for Europe. And of course, in that context, the European Union, with its young, still nascent foreign policy, is facing a moment of, as I was saying, of an existential decision, an existential choice to be made. But here again, and I think this is what our EU ambassador in Washington told you on Friday evening, Europe has always managed to get through crisis. And as Jean Monnet was saying, the European Union will be the result, the outcome of the many crises it has gone through. And I personally think this is also what is happening at the moment. We may be somewhat, how could I say it, negative or skeptical about European efforts to create a European diplomacy, but something has changed in recent days, and this is what I would like to go through at the moment. Existential moment, first of all, because this is a turning point, I think. A turning point compared to the sort of denial that Europe has been in the last 10 years when it was facing already some important crises. Think about the migration crisis and the more than 1 million migrants that came on the shores of Europe, and the way we responded to that while calling for solidarity, but not being able to deliver solidarity, is a very good example of the way we were all in a somewhat denial of the reality we were facing. Look also to some extent, and here I'm coming closer to America, the years, the Trump years, the years of the Trump administration, where Europeans went from disbelief to a sort of waiting game for all this to move away, and that we could go back to a more normal course of events and a relationship with America. Think about the Brexit and the decision of the United Kingdom to leave Europe. We were all saddened by this decision. We all think it was an historical mistake. But we decided to live with this, and many of us had this maybe false hope that by a way or another we would avoid Brexit at the end of the day, or that even if Britain is out, we would manage a way of keeping the doors open and having maybe Britain back again in a few years' time. And I think this is also maybe a little bit of denial of reality. And I could go on and on with that. And coming back to Russia, after Crimea annexation, after the occupation of 2 provinces in the Donbass, we were still thinking that maybe through dialogue we would manage to find a way of bridging the gap with Russia, and slowly, patiently finding a new common ground on which we could build something together. I think what has happened, and more than anything else, what we have heard with last Monday's speech by Vladimir Putin on television has made a whole difference. And that what has been heard there was not only dismay for all of us, but also forces us to look back again at the way history has been unfolding in Europe, for the last 50 or 60 years. Once again, this is a major change in European history, and we will have to adapt to that. But in the short term, what I find quite interesting is the way the Europeans have responded and reacted to this decision by the Russian leadership to invade Ukraine and to move military into that country. Look only, first of all, at the sanctions we have taken very speedily in a fascinating way. The last time, I think the European Council, which is the meeting of all 27 leaders of Europe, met to discuss Russia, it was in June 2021. Angela Merkel was still leading the coalition, the government in Berlin, and she had proposed that Europe should have a meeting with Vladimir Putin, because a few days before that European Council meeting, President Biden had met in Geneva President Putin. And she thought, and she was supported by the French president, that it could be useful for the Europeans also to meet with Putin. This was met with an outcry by many of the other European nations. And they said, no way. And there was a very tense and difficult meeting that took place there. Interesting conversation between all 27, but no decision at the end, and a major split among all the 27. Here we are in February 2022. And altogether, without any hesitation, we went for the package of sanction, which is one of the most comprehensive that we have ever taken. And new decisions are coming up by the day. Remember, a few days ago, we thought that Nord Stream 2, the gas pipeline between Germany and Russia, was going to be a major bone of contention between Germany and its EU partners. But no, it went very quickly. And the decision to suspend the Nord Stream gas pipeline has been taken very quickly. 1 or 2 days ago, people were saying we should move into the discussion about banning Russian banks from the SWIFT network. And today we are exactly starting to do that. So I find this quite telling and very impressive. And at the same moment, of course, we are bringing financial and military assistance to President Zelensky and his government and the Ukrainian population. And we are taking all the necessary military action inside the NATO framework, the NATO organization, to reassure and uplift our defensive posture in many of the East European countries. And this, once again, is moving very fast and in a very surprising way. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. And the other significant aspect of this is I want to remember where we're coming from. European diplomacy, European foreign policy was not part of the social contract when we launched what was going to become the European Union, this whole European integration process. If you look at the first treaty, the Rome Treaty, the Treaty of Rome in 1958, there is not one word about foreign policy, security, or defense. We had to wait until 1992 to have the Maastricht Treaty starting to put, I would say, the foot in the door and start opening it. And it's only with the Lisbon Treaty, 2009, less than 12 years ago, I would say, which started to implement a real process, a diplomatic process among the 27. And this was not done without a lot of reservation from member states. They put a lot of safety clauses there, unanimity, the possibility for any member states to go on its own if it wants to. So it looked more like a coordinated action, external action, much more that a single European policy as the one we may have in the trade field or monetary policy with the euro, the single currency. We're still very far from this. And therefore, Many people have time and again criticized for Europe for not being bold enough in the foreign policy field, but one has to understand that this foreign policy is still at a very early stage. But what is fascinating is that Russia, by its shattering move into Ukraine, has suddenly brought all the Europeans together. And I think that is quite interesting. For the last 5 years, we have been discussing all together how to set up a roadmap for the future of European security and defense policy. We call it the strategic compass. Negotiations were going on right in these days with the will and the goal of having this adopted by the end of March. My personal impression is that this discussion is going to be speeded up. It's going to move faster than we imagine, because once again, European security is at stake here, and we all understand that. Consultation with our American partners have been accelerating also, multiplying, and with a sense of cohesion that I think we have rarely seen in the past. There is not a day without phone calls between President Biden and his main partners in Europe, be it President Macron, Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and many others. And I think here again, this is something that we hadn't seen in those days. And therefore, what was mostly talk and process-led exercise that were not leading to anything really concrete or any practical action is moving in a totally different way. And I think this, once again, is something that we need to take into account. And I would say there is a sense of gravitas now among Europeans that I personally, in the many years I have been working in Brussels, I hadn't watched up to now. And I think this also may bode well for what we are trying to do at the moment. Once again, one has to be cautious, and I admit that there is a lot of uncertainty still ahead of us. Uncertainty on the ground. What is going to happen in Ukraine in the next few days? Will it be a regime change, as we fear this may happen because of the huge military superiority of the Russian military forces? Or could it be a long, protracted insurrectional situation that we may see with the population of Ukraine fighting back and taking up arms and resisting to the Russian invasion? In other words, will it be something very short? And so far, this has not happened, like we witnessed in Czechoslovakia in 1968, or will it be something different, more akin to the kind of resistance Russia faced in Afghanistan, for instance, after 1979 invasion? We shouldn't compare, of course. Ukraine and Europe is totally different from Afghanistan and the Asian continent. But still, this is the kind of feeling that we have. History is hesitating between the two, and we have to look at this very carefully. If Russia managed to get a regime change in Kiev, what kind of status are they thinking about for Ukraine? Neutrality, demilitarization, or simple comprehensive annexation of part or of the totality of Ukraine back into Russia? Listening to Putin last Monday on television, it looked very much like the third option, like not only going back to the Soviet Union, but to some extent going back to the Russian Empire of the 19th century, or even earlier on, Peter the Great years. This we will have to look at, of course. And could I add to that on the short term, the kind of testing we could see from Russia towards NATO and the European Union? The security and order in Europe is not only going to be totally transformed by the way the Helsinki Agreement and all the agreements we had agreed upon and the principles we had agreed upon for the last year, all those principles now are gone. And we have to accept that. But we are witnessing also a change of the geopolitical map of Europe. If Russia stands up and Ukraine and stands there and makes Ukraine a new part of the Russian territory, then the borders with Russia are totally different now. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, which are members of the European Union, will have direct bilateral borders with Russia. And therefore, the Russian threat becomes much more imminent and much more difficult, much more urgent to tackle. And therefore, here again, we are in a totally different situation. Two more questions that will arise in the future, of course, is the transatlantic partnership and how are we going to work together with this new imminent Russian threat. As you know, we have been discussing this a lot in recent years with this new interest on the American side for Asia and for the competition, global competition with China. There was this sense of the United States slowly drifting away from Europe. What will be the US attitude in the months and years to come now that we have seen this Russian move in Ukraine? How will we manage to consolidate and keep the transatlantic relationship as it stands and as it needs to stand up? How will the Europeans, and that's the second question, how will the Europeans stand up to this new challenge, take their part of the burden sharing the Americans have been asking for? How are we going to re-enhance and reinforce their military capabilities? And how can they, more important still, how can they have a common strategic culture about where to move, a common assessment of where the main threats lie for them and how should they respond to that? All these are the questions that we are facing. And this is why I was telling you a few minutes ago, I think we're going through an existential moment, definitely. Europe has to show, how could I say it, clear-mindedness, I would say, a sense of history as it is standing nowadays. They must have a clear sense of purpose and a clear sense of priorities as we're going to face today. We need to get our priorities right and to face the reality that for the years ahead, this is now the main challenge for Europe. This will test our resilience, and it will test also the relevance, as you were alluding to, David, at the beginning. This will test the relevance of Europe as a global actor and the ability of Europe to speak on the international scene and defend its own interest. I fear that for the time being, this is not going to be very much time for diplomacy. Because trust has been shattered in our relation with Russia. And it will take a very long time to build back trust into the diplomatic scene. But if we accept that new reality, and if we are able to work with our American partners on this, and if Europe is able to live up to the challenge, as I think it has been doing in the last week, then there is hope there. And maybe out of this crisis will come up a more united Europe, a Europe more able to defend its own interest and its own values in the international scene. And I'm very much looking forward to what I think will be very interesting times ahead of us. I'll stop there, David, and go back to you.